I realized that, hey, with AI, like it doesn't have to be this way. We can actually start looking at podcasts very differently.
That's Kevin Smith, the founder of Snipd, and he is indeed looking at podcasts very differently. Snipd is an AI native podcast player, and building it required a few mindset shifts that we'll get into. First, what even is a podcast? To Kevin, it's not just a piece of audio. To him, podcasts are knowledge. A second mindset shift is how Kevin had to retrain himself to build with generative AI in ways like this.
Let the first LLM create an output, and then we have a second LLM actually judge, hey, is this the right output?
Kevin no longer thinks in deterministic if-then-else statements, but rather,
we sort of have to almost retrain our brain to think much more human-like. Hey, how would an intern do that? And not just one intern, but maybe an organization of interns.
You'll love this episode. I learned a ton from the way Kevin builds products, and you will too. I'm Dan Blumberg, and this is Crafted. Snipd is a very different podcast app than most, and I'm not even sure calling it a podcasting app is how I'm even supposed to refer to it. I know you see it as a platform for people who want to learn. Can you describe, for those who are not familiar, what Snipd is and why it matters how you approached the world of podcasting?
Yeah, I think there are really two different ways of looking at Snipd today. So the simplistic way of looking at it is to say we're the AI native podcast app, similar to how Perplexity is the AI native search engine or Cursor is the AI native IDE for developers. So to that extent, we have a lot of AI-powered features like AI-generated transcripts, AI-generated chapters. We create little mini bios for each guest. We identify all of the books that get recommended on an episode, and you can even chat with an episode, similar to how you chat with ChatGPT. But alluring a bit to what you were saying, there's this more nuanced way of looking at it, and this is basically how we look at Snipd internally. And that is really, we're building this AI native spoken audio platform for people who very much like your audience listen to podcasts to learn, to become more knowledgeable, to follow their curiosity. And in this area, our actually most important feature, where also our name comes from, we call it snipping, is the ability to save and remember all of the amazing ideas that you hear in podcasts. And all of this simply by tapping your headphones. So how it works is whenever you hear an amazing insight, you tap your headphones and our AI summarizes the insight that you just heard and saves that together with the original transcript, the original audio in your knowledge library. And you can now return to it at any time. You can share it with friends, or you can even automatically sync it to Notion or your favorite notes app. Basically, you're automatically, just by listening to spoken audio content, you're building up your knowledge library just by tapping your headphones instead of forgetting and losing all of this valuable knowledge that you've come across.
What was it that led you to found Snipd? What was it that you found lacking?
So for me, it all starts with, before I started Snipd, I joined an early stage tech startup here in Zurich. And it was my very first startup experience. Like my first day on the job, the founder recommends this podcast to me called How to Start a Startup by Sam Altman. And every day I drove my bike to work and I was listening to this podcast, getting these amazing insights from some of the greatest entrepreneurs. And that was really the moment when I realized the immense value that podcasts have. And like that was sort of the start of looking at podcasts as one of the largest knowledge libraries in the world. And that was then also the time when I started running into these problems that now we're trying to solve with Snipd, where, you know, the typical thing is you're on your bike, you hear this amazing advice, and then you want to write it down, you want to remember it. But of course, I'm on my bike. So, you would stop at the side of the road, get out your phone, write it down, put your headphones back in and everything, and start writing again. And then the next insight comes along and you do the whole thing again. So at the end of the day, you get to a point where you stop doing that because you think, yeah, I'm going to remember anyway. But of course, you forget about it. Then the next day, you might remember like, oh, wait, there was this amazing insight. What was that about again? So you open up the podcast app, you try to find it in the podcast where it was. And because it's audio, you can't find it. You use that 20-second button like 50 times.
Yeah.
Then you do finally find it. And the next thing is, of course, I want to share it with my team, right? Like, hey, here's this amazing insight. You have to listen to this. He explains it so much better than I could ever explain it. And the only way to share this knowledge now is to send the entire episode to them. So often that's for me like a 2-hour conversation on some podcast. So you send it to them. A couple of days later, you ask them like, hey, did you listen to it? You're still super excited. And of course they didn't listen to it because it's a 2-hour conversation. So these were some of the challenges that I myself experienced as a podcast listener. And thanks to my background being in AI, I realized that, hey, with AI, like it doesn't have to be this way. We can actually start looking at podcasts very differently. Like from my perspective, basically podcast players today, they are repurposed music players.
Yeah.
So, and if you look at it historically, it makes a lot of sense. Like you had this new audio format and you have these audio players. Like, okay, you just need a play and pause button, like perfect. But once you like have that mind shift of looking at podcasts not as just audio to be consumed, but really as a knowledge library where you want to interact with it, you want to take something with you, you might want to go back to it, you want to skim through various things, you want to search, then suddenly that doesn't make any sense anymore.
I want to understand more of that mindset shift. How did that unlock the way that you built what you built?
Yeah, I think it really started with that we saw podcasts as these long form content pieces that had incredible knowledge in it, but it was often too inaccessible to maybe just dive into an interesting moment, to capture one of these moments and take it with you and go somewhere else. And this is how the whole snipping came to be, where we said, hey, when you're listening, you actually want to take a snip, which is basically a snippet, and you want to take that with you. And also when you discover new content, you might want to discover via snips because it's more approachable than here's a 2-hour conversation. And initially our thought was so many people will consume these snips and use them for discovery, but very few will actually create snips of their own. Mm-hmm. And when we released this, we actually sort of almost saw the opposite, where we saw all of these people creating so many snips. And why? Because it was, they didn't want to lose this information. So this was actually our starting point. And then with AI unlocking more and more functionality, we could really dig more into this vision of basically treating it the same way as you treat text, as you treat blog posts. What are the things that you would like to take away with it? Like, how can we turn something into, like, that is inherently intangible? How can we turn it into something tangible by, for example, extracting all of the books that get recommended and showing them to you in a nice way with the book cover and the author?
I'd love to dig in a little bit more of how you've built things. Building with generative AI can be very unpredictable. That's kind of the idea. That can cut both ways, so you can get nice surprises, you can get not so nice surprises. So how do you balance that non-deterministic nature of working with generative AI?
It does require a bit of a mind shift of how you build apps or how you code. So one example that I can use here is for every podcast episode, we identify all of the speakers in the episode. And for each speaker, we extract the name and we create a mini bio. Sometimes the output is just picture perfect and sometimes it's not. So when we started out, our mindset was much more in like the classic coding mindset of, okay, we expect a certain output, and if we don't get that output, then we need to handle that. So sort of like error handling.
Right.
But now our approach has shifted much more to, let's say, a much more dynamic way of, we actually let the first LLM create an output, and then we have a second LLM actually judge, hey, is this the right output? Does that make sense? Instead of coming up with a lot of deterministic rules of handling, sometimes the model does this, sometimes the model does that. And this is not optimal. Like here, actually the BIOS should always be a little bit longer, or that's too long. Like, no, we have a second model that actually judges that output. And if that's not good, it triggers a reprocessing of it. And then the next step in our processing is actually we have a unified database of all of the guests that have been on any podcast that we've processed. And there we have sort of this global entry of a person. But as it happens, there are, of course, multiple people who have the same name. So how do you match
Is that
them?
true, Kevin Smith?
Well, I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know.
You wouldn't know, I know.
So yeah,
I like your movies too.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. It's second passion of mine. No, the classic approach would again have been come up with a lot of if then else conditions. But now it's again, no, like you ask an LLM, like, hey, is this the same person based on the name and the mini bio that we always generate? And if not, create a new entry. Or if it is, add it to the existing entry. And the next one is like, hey, should we actually update the mini bio because things change over time? Or maybe this bio is just better because in this podcast episode, the guest was introduced much more thoroughly. And the way that I like to think of this shift in mindset or approach is similar to how a bunch of interns would solve this task manually compared to how a machine would solve it.
Yeah.
Which is very interesting because, like if you code, like basically you've trained your brain to think differently, not how I would solve it, but how would a deterministic if then else machine solve this very efficiently. And now we sort of have to almost retrain our brain to think again much more human-like. Hey, how would an intern do that? And not just one intern, but maybe an organization of interns. And there it's quite normal that you have a worker and that worker creates some output and that worker goes to his or her boss, be like, hey, is this good or not? And you might get some feedback. And so this is actually the more AI native way.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I know there's a phrase right now of like management is becoming HR for AI, right? It's just sort of what you're describing, right? Of like managing all these, you can give them names and personalities if you want to too. Are Snipd users listening to all the podcasts? Or because what you're describing here is a way that maybe you don't really have to if the AI is going to go through it and recommend some of the best quotes. Like I'm curious where the balance is of actual listening behavior, how this is changing behavior.
Yeah, so our listeners listen to full episodes. This is really the main way they interact with podcasts. And that was also something where in the very beginning, we did not yet know whether that would be the case or whether people would prefer just listening to some snips or reading through a summary. But we've really found, and I can really confirm this, like people, including myself, we just love listening to podcasts. And there is no need for a replacement of consuming long-form spoken audio. They really enjoy that. But all of the functionality that we've provided helps them a lot in deciding which episodes to listen to, where in an episode to jump into to start listening, and then taking this information with them instead of it just being lost. As to that question, I think there are some interesting developments that are now only becoming possible that we are also working on, where you'll have to re-ask that question in the future.
What are you alluding to here?
So, I mean, some of the, like one very interesting area that we're working on is voice AI. And just under voice AI, there are, again, multiple categories that are super interesting. The one thing is generating content, and that can be generating content from scratch. You can think of it as OpenAI, deep research coupled together with Notebook LM's AI-generated podcasts.
Yeah.
Another one can be remixed content, as I like to describe it, where, for example, I recently listened to a podcast where they were discussing a blog post about Apple. And it wasn't just that they summarized the blog post. No, they were adding commentary to it, new information that was valuable. Now, you can imagine this in the future actually being done by AI, that you have AI that add additional views, additional commentary to a piece of content that you already have consumed or you haven't consumed. And then there's voice as an interface. So AI voice is becoming conversational. It's not just one directional. So I actually envision it that in the future we'll be able to interrupt this podcast if you have a question. and be like, hey, Kevin just mentioned this concept of LLM as a judge. Like, please tell me more about that. Like, have other people spoken about this concept? And the AI can then actually go out and research that and come back to you, give you more information. The final aspect of voice as an interface is, especially for us, given that we are a spoken audio app, like usually you listen to spoken audio while you're doing something else. So your eyes are busy, but your brain is not. That's usually like the moments in your life that we're tackling. And the most natural thing, of course, is if you want to control the app, if you want to do something, like asking a question is one thing, but the other thing is also taking a snip, adding a voice memo. You could now do this via voice instead of having to take out your phone. And one feature that I personally am quite excited about there is that we try to help our users do is to retain the information that they've consumed and like help them learn more. And one of the most effective ways of doing that is to actually reflect upon the content that you've consumed. Now, the difficulty with podcasts is that to reflect upon a content, you have to go back to it at some point. So at some point, you have to open up our app and you have to go back to your snips and review them. But if you have voice AI, what you can do is at the end of an episode, instead of just jumping to the next episode, and you're already forgetting everything that you just listened to and learned, you can actually take this moment to have your voice AI companion come on and talk to you about what you've actually just consumed and help you reflect what were actually the most important takeaways for you personally that you want to take away. And this creates sort of new experiences and new modalities in a way that were not possible before at all.
Yeah, and not only can it help you with recall, I mean, this reminds me of like lots of homework I've had, when I was a kid, of like 3 things you learned from the assignment that I gave you. You could also go a step further there and record what the person says. Hey, what'd you learn from this episode? And you could turn that into a social media post if they wanted to post. There's some folks building different things like that just to help people get thoughts out of their head. I saw you speak at an event recently, and you said that with AI, apps will become your best friends. And I'd love if you could expand a bit on what you meant when you said that.
Yeah, like right now, we also describe ourselves as the AI-powered podcast app or the AI-powered spoken audio platform. So today, AI is still a feature, but I think in the relatively near future, it will cease to be a feature, but it will just be something that people expect, the same way as today we don't say that, I have this electricity-powered kettle at home. Like, no, it's just a water cooker. It's just... And once you have that kind of mindset, you realize, okay, AI will be in everything. So with that in mind, I think for me, it becomes obvious that every app that I use regularly, where I have a lot of interaction points, it will be similar to any real life experience where I might have a lot of interaction points with a single human. If every morning I go get my coffee from the same place and it's the same barista there, and we do that every day, like that person starts to get to know me somehow, and we start to build up a relationship. And if I have an app that I use every day, maybe not just once, but 5 times a day, it will start to be the same dynamic will start to occur, especially if it's any kind of app where you might be even talking in voice with it, because it's this very natural human way of just having a little chit chat here and there. So if you take that further, it's clear like then every app, at least if you use it regularly, will become sort of like your best friend. It will get to know you, will get to know your preferences very well. And one thing here that I'm not so sure yet, where sort of this is maybe a great startup idea for someone. Today we have like these sign in with Google, sign in with Apple ways of signing up for apps. Will there be such a service where you can maybe sign in with an AI service provider that actually comes with a certain memory, a certain personality that is attached to you?
Yeah. And
so you can then log into Netflix, and actually this login system already knows all of the preferences that you have, and it brings that with you, and you can now like kickstart right away with, hey Dan, I know you're super into anime.
To think that gets
that was
very
sort of the
interesting
thing.
if you still own yourself, basically, where you can permission Netflix to know something temporarily. Maybe they don't know it forever, or maybe it's something a little more personal than Netflix. I remember ideas like this came up when blockchain was more having its moment of you'd have your identity and you could unlock the vault, for this doctor or for that provider, but you retain it. I can definitely see that. How has Snipd become your best friend?
For me, some of these aspects that we've now spoken about is not yet implemented in our app. So I think these are more glimpses into the future where I see Snipd heading. But to expand a bit more on that, just recently someone reminded me of this quote: "You are basically the average of your 5 closest friends." And the first thing that popped into my mind when I heard that was, wait, can I count my podcast friends as well?
Yeah.
Because that's what it really feels like to me. I listen to these podcasts and they have a huge impact on me because I learn from these incredible people, and it's almost as if I have them as friends, right? And if these podcasts keep having people on where they talk about how you should be exercising and how you should be maybe taking this supplement or that supplement and how important sleep is, then at some point you're like, oh, yeah, okay, maybe I should also look into that. So here I am doing a workout every morning and taking supplements and making sure I get enough sleep. So this is sort of maybe my extended answer of how podcasts in general are some of my best friends.
I love it. How do you think the future that you're describing, that you're building, with different ways to ingest or talk back to, or maybe like have one podcast A talk to podcast B, I can imagine a scenario like that. How do you think that changes what podcasters may create in the first place?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think it very much depends on the podcaster, what kind of podcasts they are creating. So, for example, for a lot of the podcasts that I listen to, the reason why I listen to that is because they have a person on who has had some kind of experience that I'm interested in, and I'm interested in getting that from that person. So this is a very different situation to, for example, a true crime podcast or a podcast that is much more informational based or story based. A podcast that just comes to mind is Acquired, where they don't have a guest on, but they tell the story of a company, right? And if you're telling the story of Meta, for example, I think it was a 6-hour episode about the history of Meta. You can picture that maybe in the future, you might even create a longer episode on that. And you then let the AI create shorter versions for people who just want the 30-minute version or the 2-hour version. Or you might add actually much more information, like supplementary reading or supplementary context, that if the user has a question, they don't have to go through 100 pages of material that they use for their research. But if you have a question, you can ask it and the AI can actually access all of these documents that they found for this story. So these might be ways of how it's changing. And I wouldn't be surprised if we will get the first AI host to host its own podcast, which will also be very interesting to see how that will evolve. I do believe that this is something that will happen, but it will be very important that there is a distinct, consistent personality and character that provides some kind of reason why you would want to listen or would want to have this person interview another person. But it will definitely happen.
Yeah. I think that's a fun and interesting note to end on. Kevin, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan. And of course, if anyone listening would like to try out Snipd, you can find us online. Just search for Snipd, SNIPD. I'm also very happy to provide a promo link such that anyone who wants to try out our premium version, so we have a free version and a premium version, you could use that via the link in the show notes.
That's Kevin Smith. I'm Dan Blumberg, and this is Crafted. And if you like this episode, and hey, you've made it this far, please share it with a friend. Just one friend. That's how podcasts grow. Crafted.fm is where to send them, and it's also where you can subscribe to the Crafted newsletter. Thanks, and see you next time.